This is Amber, the family's little freeloader, my mother scoffed, introducing me to Sterling. She's useless, but we're keeping her. She chuckled, awaiting his approval. Sterling's face stiffened. He ignored her and looked at me with profound respect. "You're wrong, Lizzie," he said. "She's the strategist who saved my company from bankruptcy. I owe her everything." Her smile vanished instantly. I looked into her empty eyes, turned, and walked toward the door, letting the cold air carry away her lies. The rain in River Oaks doesn't just fall. It drapes itself over the sprawling estates like a heavy, suffocating shroud of gray silk. Standing by the service entrance of my family's mansion, I felt the damp chill seep through my thin trench coat, settling into my bones with a familiar, gnawing ache. A few yards away, the grand foyer glowed with the warm, amber light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers, casting long, mocking shadows across the manicured lawn. My mother, Lizzie, was in there, orchestrating the final touches of her engagement gala, a celebration of a new life that seemingly had no room for the old one I represented. True wealth is often quiet, a steady hum in the background of a well-ordered life, but insecurity is loud, demanding an audience at every turn. I stood in the darkness not because I lacked the means to be inside, but because of a promise I whispered to my father before the machines in his hospital room went silent. I promised to keep the walls of this family standing for as long as they deserved to be, even if those walls were now being painted over with lies. Watching the silhouettes dance behind the frosted glass, I realized that some people spend their whole lives building monuments to themselves, forgetting that the strongest foundations are the ones nobody ever sees. Movement near the driveway caught my eye. An elderly florist was struggling with a massive wooden crate of white lilies, his boots slipping on the slick cobblestones. I didn't think, I simply moved. Reaching out, I braced the edge of the crate, the rough wood biting into my palms as we guided it onto a rolling cart. The man looked at me, his eyes wide with a mix of surprise and exhaustion. I gave him a small, weary smile and whispered, "Careful now. No labor is invisible to those who actually look." It was a small moment, a fragment of grace in a night designed for vanity, but it felt more real than anything happening inside those gold-leafed walls. The heavy glass doors of the veranda creaked open, and Lizzie stepped out, looking like a portrait of tragic elegance in $50,000 of shimmering silk. She didn't see the florist, and she certainly didn't see the mud on my hem. She only saw an obstacle to her perfection. "Amber, stop playing in the dirt," she snapped, her voice cutting through the rhythmic patter of the rain like a jagged blade. She handed me a tablet with a gloved hand, careful not to let our skin touch. "Stay here at the service gate. You'll verify the QR codes for the late arrivals. Your drab presence would only ruin the aesthetic of the grand entrance, and I won't have Sterling's associates thinking we raised a servant." I took the tablet without a word. I've learned that you cannot be insulted by those you do not respect. Yet the sting of her words still lingered, a phantom pain from a childhood spent trying to earn a love that was always conditional. As she retreated into the warmth, leaving me alone in the downpour, I looked down at the screen. To the world, I was the daughter who couldn't keep a job, the freeloader Lizzie complained about over bridge games. But as my thumb swiped across the encrypted interface, the real world bled through. I wasn't just checking guest lists, I was digitally signing a multi-million-dollar debt restructuring plan for a local children's hospital. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was saving lives in the dark while my family played house in the light. The sound of tires splashing through puddles signaled the arrival of the next wave of guests. A bright red convertible skidded to a halt, and my sister, Jolene, hopped out, shielded by a massive golf umbrella held by one of her socialite hangers-on. She spotted me and stopped, a cruel light dancing in her eyes. "Oh, look, girls," Jolene chirped, gesturing toward me with a manicured hand. "It's Amber, finally earning her keep. I guess Mom grew tired of feeding a stray." Her friends giggled, their expensive perfumes clashing with the scent of wet earth and ozone. One of the girls, a blonde I vaguely remembered from high school, reached into her designer clutch and tossed a handful of quarters and crumpled $1 bills at my feet. The coins clinked sharply against the stone, a tiny metallic symphony of humiliation. "Here," she laughed. "Buy yourself a decent meal so you don't look so hollow at the dinner table." Lizzie watched from the doorway, a faint, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She didn't intervene. She didn't defend me. She simply watched the rain wash over the money at my feet, as if she were pleased to see me finally assigned a price. I didn't lose my composure. I didn't yell. I simply knelt down, my knees pressed into the cold, damp ground, and began picking up the coins. I didn't do it out of greed. I did it because I valued the worth of an earned dollar more than $1 million inherited. Each coin represented a labor my family would never understand. When I stood up, my hands clutching the cold coins, I looked at Jolene and her friends with a calmness that seemed to disorient them. They weren't mocking me. They were mocking a non-existent version of me. They were battling a shadow while I held the light to guide them. A sudden hush fell over the garden as a sleek black SUV pulled up to the gate. The engine's low growl was the only sound against the rain. This was the arrival everyone had been waiting for. Sterling, the billionaire fiancé whose capital was supposed to be the final brick in Lizzie's new fortress, stepped out. He was exactly as the magazines described him, powerful, composed, and radiating a quiet authority that made the air feel suddenly thick. He didn't look at the house, and he didn't look at Lizzie, who was already fluttering toward him like a moth to a flame. He stopped. His gaze fell to the ground, where a single quarter still glittered in a puddle, then shifted to my wet hair and the muddy hem of my coat. I stood my ground, the water dripping from my nose, my eyes meeting his in a moment of silent, mutual recognition. There was an intelligence in his stare that Lizzie and the others were too blind to possess. He saw the tablet in my hand, he saw the bruise of exhaustion under my eyes, and he saw the dignity I refused to surrender. Sterling walked toward the gate, completely ignoring Lizzie's outstretched silken arm. He stopped directly in front of me, his brow furrowed in a mixture of confusion and a burgeoning dark fury that made Lizzie's smirk vanish instantly. He looked at the wet coins still clutched in my hand, then back up at my face, his voice low and dangerous. Sterling's eyes narrowed as he looked at the wet coins still clutched in Amber's hand, then up at Lizzie's triumphant smile. The wet coins felt like frozen, jagged stones against my palm, a cold, physical reminder of the price my family placed on my dignity. Sterling didn't move for a long heartbeat, his gaze lingering on the handful of quarters and crumpled ones I held with a steady, unyielding hand. Lizzie's triumphant smirk was a sharp contrast to the gathering storm in his eyes, a storm she was too intoxicated by her own perceived victory to notice. I saw her reach out, her silk-clad arm a graceful curve designed to steer him away from the embarrassment at the gate. But Sterling remained rooted to the spot. He didn't say a word as he reached up, unbuttoning his charcoal cashmere coat with deliberate, slow movements. Before Lizzie could utter another word of mockery, he draped the heavy, warm fabric over my shivering shoulders. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloped me, a sudden and startling shield against the Houston rain. Lizzie's face twitched, the mask of the perfect hostess slipping just enough to reveal a flash of pure, vitriolic insult. To her, this wasn't an act of kindness. It was a public betrayal of the social hierarchy she had worked so hard to maintain. I looked Sterling directly in the eye, my voice as calm as a mountain lake, despite the ice in my veins. "Thank you, Sterling," I said, the weight of his coat grounding me. "True character is found in how we treat those who can do absolutely nothing for us. My father used to say that's the only real metric of a man's worth." The words hit the air with a quiet authority that left him visibly struck, his jaw tightening as he processed the depth in the eyes of the woman he had been told was a hollow failure. Have you ever stood in the rain and realized that a stranger's cloak offered more warmth than your own mother's heart? Lizzie's laughter was thin and brittle as she forcefully maneuvered Sterling toward the glowing ballroom. "Oh, Sterling, you're far too soft-hearted," she chirped, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Amber loves the drama. She'll stay out here until the last guest arrives just to make us feel guilty for her own choices." She threw a sharp, warning glance over her shoulder, a silent command for me to stay in the shadows where I belonged. I watched them vanish into the golden light, the heavy glass doors clicking shut like the lid of a tomb. I didn't rush. I didn't crumble. I simply stood there, cloaked in a billionaire's warmth, finishing the job they thought was my cage, but was actually my vantage point. By the time I entered the ballroom through the side service door, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the hushed murmurs of Houston's elite. I kept Sterling's coat on, the oversized garment a dark silhouette against the sea of sequins and tuxedos. I saw the ripples of whispered curiosity as I moved through the crowd. The freeloader in the CEO's coat was a sight no one expected. Lizzie spotted me from across the room, her eyes widening as she clutched a flute of vintage champagne. She was fueled by social insecurity now, a dangerous cocktail that made her movements jagged and unpredictable. She marched toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble. As she reached me, she performed a practiced theatrical stumble, a feigned trip that sent her champagne splashing onto the floor. I instinctively reached out to steady her, an old reflex of a daughter still trying to catch a falling star. But as I leaned forward, Lizzie's eyes turned cold and predatory. She shifted her weight, driving the sharp point of her stiletto directly onto my bare hand as it rested against a low pedestal. The pain was a white-hot flash that raced up my arm, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of a scream. "Amber, you clumsy girl!" Lizzie hissed loudly, her voice carrying to the surrounding investors. "Must you always try to steal the spotlight with these pathetic scenes? First you begged Sterling for his coat, and now you're practically tripping over your own feet just to get near him." She leaned in closer, her heel grinding deeper into my skin, her breath smelling of expensive grapes and bitter envy. I looked at her, not with anger, but with a sharp, analytical clarity. Pain is a signal, not a master. While she tried to crush my hand, my mind was busy calculating the interest on the secret loans Gacy had taken against the River Oaks estate. I wasn't just surviving her cruelty, I was preparing for the audit. I slowly withdrew my hand after she finally gave in, my skin bruised and torn, but my spirit unharmed. Her despair was a sign of the end. A few minutes later, Gacy approached me from a secluded corner, his face pale and sweaty under the ballroom lights. "Amber, I need the combination to the old safe," he whispered, his eyes glancing at Sterling. "I'm holding the family seal, and if I don't get it back by tomorrow morning, the creditors will come to seize the house. You must hide it for me. Mother said you would." I looked at my brother, the son who shone but was essentially an empty shell. "Lying is the final debt that bankrupts the soul, Gacy," I said to him, my voice like a hammer. "I don't want to pay him interest anymore." Across the room, I watched Lizzie holding court with a group of potential donors, her voice high and melodic as she claimed credit for the scholarship fund I had spent 3 years building in secret. She was the guiding light, the matriarch of Houston charity, while I stood in the corner with a bruised hand and a heavy coat. But Sterling was watching too. I saw him from the periphery, his gaze moving from Lizzie's animated face to the dark mark on my hand, then back to the service entrance where I had stood in the rain. The suspicion in his eyes was turning into a cold, hard realization, the kind of truth that can't be unlearned. Lizzie retreated to the powder room to check her reflection, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of her own malice. I followed her inside, the quiet of the marble room a stark contrast to the roar of the party. I didn't confront her about the stiletto or the lies. Instead, I picked up a damp cloth and gently wiped a smear of lipstick from her chin, a final act of filial mercy that seemed to terrify her more than a scream ever could. "I am not your enemy, Lizzie," I whispered, our eyes meeting in the mirror. "I am your mirror. You just don't like what you see." She stared at me, the silence between us heavy with the things a mother should never do to a child. Sterling's voice boomed over the speakers, calling the guests back to the ballroom for the pre-engagement speech. I walked back out and stood by the servants' entrance, the dark cashmere still draped over my shoulders. The room went dead silent as he approached the microphone, the feedback a sharp, jarring sound that made everyone wince. He didn't look at the champagne or the flowers. He didn't look at Lizzie, who was already smoothing her dress in anticipation of her moment of glory. Instead, his eyes fixed on mine with a startling intensity. That's where it all started. Sterling tapped the microphone, the feedback echoing through the silent room as he took a deep breath, his eyes locked onto Amber. Lizzie glided to the podium like a swan returning to the lake, her hand reaching out to grasp my wrist with a grip that contrasted sharply with her graceful smile. She pulled me toward the center of the stage, thrusting me into the blinding glare of the spotlights. I felt the collective weight of 500 pairs of judgmental eyes. Houston's elite, raised on the lies my mother had skillfully orchestrated for a decade. Lizzie leaned into the microphone, her voice dripping with the kind of artificial sweetness that leaves a metallic aftertaste. "I wanted to take a moment," she began, her smirk widening as she looked out at the crowd, "to introduce the one member of our family you rarely see. This is Amber, our youngest. As many of you know, every family has its permanent freeloader." A ripple of practiced, polite laughter moved through the hall. Lizzie squeezed my bruised hand, her tone shifting to a mock, pitiful sigh. "We do our best to support her, but some people are just destined to be useless. I suppose we all have our crosses to bear." I stood there, exposed and labeled, listening to my own mother dissect my dignity for sport. Have you ever stood in a room full of people and realized the person who gave you life was the one most eager to see you destroyed? I thought of the old wisdom that the loudest person in the room is often the weakest. Even as the social suffocation reached its peak, I looked at Lizzie and felt a pang of profound sadness. I was giving her the final chance to be a mother, to show even a flicker of humanity. But she was choosing to be a predator. My name was Amber, but in this room, she had made me a ghost. Lizzie finished her cruel little joke and turned to Sterling, her face glowing with the expectation of his joining the mockery. She waited for the laughter, for the shared wink that would seal my fate as the family's resident failure. Instead, Sterling turned away from her with a slow, deliberate grace. The professional mask he wore shattered, revealing a face of cold, focused fury. He didn't look at the champagne. He didn't look at the glittering guests. He looked only at me. The air in the room seemed to thin, the atmosphere shifting from a celebration to an execution in the span of a single breath. Sterling stepped toward the microphone, his voice thundering through the ballroom with an authority that made the crystal chandeliers tremble. "I didn't come to River Oaks tonight to celebrate an engagement to a socialite," he stated, his words cutting through the hushed whispers like a guillotine. "I came here because I was told I would finally meet the angel investor who saved Sterling Global. Last year, my company was facing a $500 million hostile takeover that would have cost 20,000 Americans their jobs. I was saved by a brilliant, anonymous strategist who authored a restructuring plan so precise it was surgical." He reached out, his hand pointing directly at me, and for the first time, the spotlights felt like a crown instead of a target. "That strategist is standing right here. Your freeloader is the woman who stabilized my empire while you were busy picking out floral arrangements." The revelation hit the room like a seismic wave. I stayed calm, my pulse steady. Gifts aren't given to us to boast, but to serve those who cannot save themselves. I had used my mind to protect thousands of families, while my own mother used hers to try and sell me for a status symbol. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. Lizzie's face turned the color of ash, her fingers trembling so violently that her champagne flute clattered against the podium. "Sterling, darling," she stuttered, her voice cracking as she tried to weave a new lie. "There must be a mistake. Amber, she probably found those papers in my office. I was the one who—" Sterling shut her down with a single icy look that would have frozen a Texas summer. The guests, once mocking, were now staring in stunned silence. The freeloader was gone. In her place stood a titan they didn't recognize. I stepped forward, but I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply leaned over and took Sterling's cashmere coat from where it had slipped onto the back of a chair. "Success isn't about being seen, Mother," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "It's about making sure the foundation doesn't crumble while you're busy painting the walls. You spent so much time trying to make me invisible that you forgot I was the one holding up the house." I turned to Sterling, giving him a nod of professional respect. "The investment documents for the new subsidiary are being finalized tomorrow. I suggest you check the signatures carefully." Sterling's eyes flickered with a hidden knowledge. Indeed, and as for the family assets, Amber's control over the trust's liquidation is far more comprehensive than anyone realized. The legal foreshadowing hung in the air like a looming storm. I didn't stay for the applause or the apologies that I knew would follow once the vultures realized I held the purse strings. I turned and walked off the stage, my head held high, leaving Lizzie standing alone in the harsh glare of the lights. The whispers were starting again, but this time they weren't about my failure. They were about her fraud. As I exited the ballroom and moved into the dim, quiet hallway, I felt the adrenaline begin to fade, replaced by a weary, triumphant peace. But the night wasn't over. Near the staircase, I saw Jolene and Gacy huddled together, their faces pale and desperate. They were whispering frantically, their hands clutching a stolen leather portfolio. My portfolio. It contained the decrypted legal passwords to the family's offshore holdings and my private accounts. That's where the battle for my future really began. Jolene tucked the leather portfolio under her arm and shared a desperate, wicked glance with Gacy as they watched Amber approach. They didn't even try to conceal the theft. They simply burst into Lizzie's private study just as our mother rushed in from the ballroom, her face as pale as a cracked porcelain mask from panic. Sterling followed closely behind, his presence like a silent, judgmental guardian that Lizzie desperately wanted to break free from. Lizzie didn't waste a second. She lunged for a drawer in her mahogany desk, pulling out a sheaf of papers with trembling hands. "Sterling, darling, you have to listen to me," she wailed, her voice hitting a fever pitch of staged desperation. "Amber is a thief. She's been siphoning my ideas for years. Look at this. This is the original strategy for the logistics overhaul. I wrote it. Amber was just the typist, a lowly assistant I kept on out of pity." She shoved the forged document towards Sterling, her eyes wide and bloodshot, pleading for him to believe the lie over the woman who actually saved him. I stood by the heavy oak door, my expression unruffled, watching her descent with a quiet, analytical pity. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. But in the digital age, shoes are unnecessary. "Sterling," I said, my voice cutting through Lizzie's hysterics like a cool breeze. "Check the bottom right margin under a UV light, or simply scan the metadata. I embed a unique digital watermark in all my authentic filings, a forensic signature no photocopy can replicate." Lizzie's hand froze midair, her bluff called by a technology she didn't even know existed. I looked at her, truly looked at her, beyond the silk and the fillers and the years of manufactured prestige. "I'd rather you be remembered as a mother who lost her way than a woman who lost her soul, Lizzie," I whispered. It was a final bridge, a graceful way out that required only a shred of honesty. But she didn't even blink. She snatched the paper back, her eyes darting to Gacy as she ignored the olive branch in favor of her own greed. Some people don't want to be saved. They just want to make sure everyone else drowns with them. I didn't wait for her permission to end the theater. I reached into Sterling's coat pocket, where I had slipped my tablet earlier, and logged into the family's joint expense accounts with a single thumbprint. I projected the screen onto the study's large monitor, the forensic trail of Lizzie's spending illuminating the room in a harsh blue glow. Sterling watched in a silence that was louder than any scream as the facade of the Texas socialite crumbled under the weight of cold, hard data. "This is what I called the Black Ledger," I stated, scrolling through months of line items. "It's a record of Lizzie using my supplementary credit cards to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford. But it goes deeper. She's surreptitiously claimed my medical power of attorney while I was recovering from surgery last year, using it as a backdoor to access my private trust funds." I pointed to a specific wire transfer. "The dresses, the jewelry, even the catering for this very party. All paid for by the daughter you spent the evening calling a freeloader. You've been a guest in your own life, Lizzie, and I've been the one paying the bill." The room was deathly silent. Integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching, and especially doing the right thing when you think you've successfully concealed the evidence. Lizzie watched the crowd of guests at the door, their expressions shifting from astonishment to utter disgust. She had lived for their admiration, and now she was dying from their judgment. The most painful part wasn't the theft of the money. It was the theft of the relationship I'd pretended we could have. The sibling bond, already thin, dissolved into a chaotic mess of self-preservation right before my eyes. Gacy, seeing the ship sinking, grabbed the stolen portfolio and pointed a finger at Lizzie. "It was her idea. She told me Amber wouldn't notice. She said we deserved the money for putting up with her," Jolene chimed in, her voice a shrill whine as she tried to distance herself from the fraud. I didn't feel joy in their collapse. I felt a deep, quiet pity for the hollow lives they had built. "The price of hate is too high for me to pay," so I chose to let them face the law instead of my anger. Lizzie, cornered and manic, didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, she leaned toward Gacy and whispered a command that chilled the room. Call the backup plan. Now. The conflict shifted instantly. This wasn't just about ledgers and bank accounts anymore. It was about an alliance with an outside party that moved into dangerous, uncharted territory. Sterling stepped closer to me, his hand resting protectively on my shoulder. I have my legal team and personal security on standby, Amber. We are filing a formal report for identity theft and financial fraud tonight. This ends now. But as the lights in the study flickered, a sharp, rhythmic vibration came from my pocket. I pulled out my phone and felt my heart skip a beat. The screen was flashing a bright, rhythmic red, a series of forced entry notifications from my private residence downtown. Gacy had sent someone to my home to find the physical hard drives he thought I'd hidden there. The battle was no longer in the ballroom. It was at my front door. The security alert on Amber's phone flashed a bright, rhythmic red, mirroring the sudden, dangerous pounding in her chest as Gacy reached for his jacket. Through the graininess of the live feed, I watched shadows moving outside my downtown penthouse. Hired hands Gacy had sent to scrub the evidence he thought existed within my private walls. But as Gacy reached for his jacket to flee, the heavy study doors swung open. A professional process server, a man I had hired 3 hours ago, stepped into the gala. He didn't look at the crystal or the silk. He walked straight to the mahogany desk and placed a stack of blue-backed legal documents in the center of Lizzie's world. I didn't let Gacy take a step. "Sit down, Gacy," I said, my voice cutting through the sudden quiet of the room. I picked up the top document, the blood mortgage. It was the forensic proof that Gacy had used this very River Oaks mansion as collateral for a $2.5 million illegal gambling debt with a shark in Galveston. I turned the page to the most important part, the assignment of debt. "Lizzie, you call me a freeloader. Yet I am the one who just purchased this debt note from the original creditor. As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, I am the official owner of this house. You aren't hosting a gala, you are trespassing in my property." Lizzie's scream was a jagged, ugly sound that tore through the air. "You're stealing my home! You've plotted this since the day your father died!" she shrieked, her face twisting into something unrecognizable. I looked at her, my heart heavy with a grief that had nothing to do with money. "A house is built with bricks, Mother, but a home is built with truth. You destroyed this home long before I bought the house." I looked at Gacy and Jolene, their faces pale under the flickering study lights. "The price of greatness is responsibility. You spent your lives running from yours, and now the bill has come due." Cornered and desperate, Lizzie's survival instinct turned into a poisonous counterattack. She lunged for her desk, pulling out a forged psychiatric report she had prepared weeks ago. "No one will believe a word you say," she gasped, looking at the confused guests in the doorway. "Amber is mentally unstable. She's been under private care for months. These people here," she gestured to a group of thick-necked men standing near the shadows, "are family friends here to take her to a facility for her own safety." I recognized them instantly. Not family friends, but hired muscle for an offshore billionaire. The room went dead silent as Jolene suddenly collapsed into a chair, her composure finally shattering. "Mom, stop it! They're going to find out!" Jolene wailed, her eyes darting toward the security cameras I had pointed out. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a crumpled, crimson-stamped document, the human contract. "Lizzie signed it, Amber. She signed an agreement to deliver you into a marriage with that tycoon in Macau to clear Gacy's debts. They're not taking you to a hospital. They're taking you to the airport." I stared at Lizzie, the air leaving my lungs as if I'd been struck in the chest. "You didn't just fail as a mother, Lizzie. You succeeded as a trafficker." The woman who had brushed my hair and tucked me into bed had placed a market value on my soul. "There is no abyss deeper than the one you've dug tonight," I whispered, the words feeling like cold ash in my mouth. "Have you ever looked at the person who gave you life and realized they were the one holding the knife to your throat? Freedom is not the absence of people, but the presence of the right to choose who stays." The men in the shadows advanced, their intentions clear, to separate me from Sterling. "For her!" one snarled, reaching for my arm. But Sterling stepped between us, his bodyguards forming a wall of black suits and ironclad resolve. "Touch her," Sterling said, his voice low and menacing. "And you'll see how much power I still wield in this city." He wasn't just protecting me. He stood there as a witness to the men in the shadows. The parasite was the only one in the room with a pure heart. I didn't panic. I tapped a command on my phone, turning the large monitor in the study into a mirror of my digital world. "Everything said in this room for the last hour has been live-streamed to a secure cloud server," I informed Lizzie. "My legal counsel and the Houston PD have the coordinates. You're not taking me anywhere." I looked at Jolene, seeing the terror in her eyes. "It's not too late to walk away from this rot, Jolene. Truth is a painful medicine, but it's the only one that can save you now." Sterling turned back to Lizzie, his face a mask of cold, professional disgust. "The human contract is a felony under federal human trafficking statutes, Lizzie. I have already contacted the authorities to intercept the associates of your offshore partner." The facade of the Texas matriarch was gone. Lizzie was now just a woman standing in the ruins of her own making. But as the distant sound of sirens began to wail, a much louder sound erupted from the front of the mansion. The front gates of the mansion were rammed by a heavy black van, the sound of metal twisting echoing through the night. The grand ballroom glass doors shattered inward in a slow-motion explosion of crystal shards, as a group of unidentified men in suits burst into the room. They weren't police. They were the tycoon's extraction team, sent to collect on Lizzie's debt before the law arrived. The sound of shattering glass drowned out Lizzie's screams as the intruders surged into the ballroom, their eyes locked onto Amber. The sound of shattering glass felt like the final rhythmic heartbeat of my childhood dying in real time. As the ballroom doors disintegrated into a million crystalline shards, I stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos. Fear is a reaction, but courage is a decision, and I had decided long ago that I would no longer be the victim of this family's frantic, ugly greed. Sterling's security team surged forward, a wall of dark suits and lethal intent, intercepting the intruders before they could reach the stage. I watched the struggle with a cold, analytical clarity, my hand resting firmly on the leather binder that held the truth of our destruction. Lizzie was screaming, a high-pitched, animalistic sound that clawed at the air, but I didn't move to hide. Instead, I reached into the hidden compartment of my binder and activated the silent distress signal to the private tactical response unit I had placed on retainer months ago. I looked at my mother, who was currently cowering behind a marble pillar, and for the first time I saw her for exactly what she was. A hollow vessel fueled by the admiration of people who didn't even like her. I knew about the human contract from the moment the first encrypted email left her laptop, and I had waited for this exact moment to prove that mercy is not weakness. It is the ultimate expression of power. As the Houston PD sirens began to wail in the distance, their blue and red lights strobe flashing against the gilded walls, I stepped between Lizzie and the last remaining intruder. I wasn't protecting her because she deserved it. I was protecting her because I refused to let her sins turn me into someone who watches a murder in silence. I signaled Sterling to usher the remaining guests into the mansion's reinforced safe room, turning the ballroom into a private stage for the final act of this tragedy. I held the binder high, the original, unnotarized versions of Lizzie's fraudulent contracts. With a single flick of my wrist, I showed her the legal void she had built her future upon. The adrenaline began to simmer down into a cold, focused resolve as the police finally secured the perimeter, detaining the tycoon's men in the rain-slicked driveway. I walked toward Lizzie, Gacy, and Jolene, who were huddled together in the ruins of the buffet line. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, a confession of financial fraud, and a commitment to return the tuition funds stolen from me 20 years ago. "Sign this, Lizzie," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "Return what you took, admit the truth to the authorities, and I will ensure the human trafficking charges are mitigated. It is your only path to redemption." I watched her eyes, searching for a flicker of the mother who used to read me stories before the greed took root. For a second, her hand shook as she reached for the pen. But then, the manic pride that had defined her life surged back into her face. Lizzie took the paper, and with a slow, deliberate sneer, she ripped it into tiny, jagged shreds. She spat at my feet, the white silk of her dress stained with the wine of a ruined gala. "You were never a daughter, Amber," she hissed, her voice a poisonous rasp. "You were just a transaction that failed. I'd rather go to prison than admit you were ever smarter than me." The sound of tearing paper echoed as if the last anchor of my emotions had been crushed to the ground. The transformation was complete. My eyes, once filled with anguish, now shone with a clear, unwavering blue. You can't save someone who loves their own darkness. And I had finally freed myself from decades of the guilt of a dutiful daughter that had imprisoned me in an invisible cage. I spoke in a voice so soft it seemed to haunt the empty ballroom. "I didn't do this to save you, Lizzie. I did this to see if there was any trace of the mother I remembered. Now I know. The seat is empty." That was precisely my moment of freedom. I didn't waste another second on sentiment. I produced the writ of possession and the emergency eviction order, the legal hammer I had been forging in the dark. I looked at the three of them, the mother, the brother, the sister, and felt nothing but a vast, quiet space where my love used to be. "I am the legal owner of this mansion and the holder of every debt Gacy has accrued," I informed them. "The sheriff's deputies are at the door. You have exactly 30 minutes to vacate this property. Take what belongs to you, which, according to these ledgers, is absolutely nothing." Gacy and Jolene instantly turned on each other, a frantic, pathetic scramble to pack designer bags and silver spoons. I watched my siblings fight over a pair of gold cufflinks while the life they knew evaporated around them. I reminded the officers to escort Lizzie to a modest, prepaid apartment on the outskirts of town, an act of human dignity she had never afforded me. "I will not be the monster you want me to be," I thought as I watched them go. My victory wasn't in their suffering, but in my own unshakable standards. Sterling stood by my side, his hand hovering near mine, offering a support I finally felt worthy of accepting. But not yet. I took a step back, needing to stand alone in the center of the ruin for one last moment. I looked up at the vaulted ceiling of the River Oaks mansion and didn't see a palace anymore. I saw a cage with the door standing wide open. The silence was absolute now, the heavy door of my past finally clicking shut. As the police led a hysterical Lizzie toward the exit, she suddenly stopped. The strobe lights from the driveway caught the madness in her eyes as she turned back toward me. The officers tried to pull her away, but she lunged forward, her voice a poisonous rasp against my ear that froze the air in my lungs. She revealed a single, chilling secret about my father's death, a truth he had died trying to hide, a truth that changed the very nature of my victory into a dark, new mystery. The poisonous rasp of Lizzie's voice lingered in the cold morning air, a final attempt to anchor me to a past that no longer owned my future. I pulled back from her touch, watching as the Houston Sheriff's deputies gently but firmly led her toward the waiting cruiser. Her desperate secret about my father's death felt like a dying ember, bright for a second, but ultimately destined to turn to ash. I realized then that some people will burn down the whole forest just to keep themselves warm for one more night. I chose not to let her fire consume me. I stood on the sidewalk of River Oaks, my breath hitching as I watched the official seals being placed on the grand mahogany doors of the mansion. The absolute authority I had fought for was now a matter of public record, the deed transfer and eviction affidavits finalized with the cold precision of a gavel. Lizzie, Gacy, and Jolene stood by the curb with nothing but their personal suitcases, the glittering facade of the Miles family fortune officially reclaimed by the daughter they had spent a lifetime erasing. I didn't feel the rush of vengeance I expected. I only felt a vast, sweeping relief. Looking at them one last time, I didn't see the monsters of my childhood. I saw three people who had forgotten how to walk without a golden crutch. "I am not punishing you by taking this house," I said, my voice steady and devoid of malice. "I am saving you by forcing you to finally find the strength to earn your own way. You cannot find your soul in a house built on someone else's shadow." I turned away as the transport moved out, leaving the hollow monument of River Oaks behind. A week later, I found myself at my father's grave, the Texas live oaks casting long, protective shadows over the headstone. I brought the original college fund ledger with me, the one Lizzie had plundered 2 decades ago. I sat on the grass and realized that character truly is destiny. My father's greatest gift wasn't the trust fund or the name. It was the unshakable resilience he knew I possessed. He knew I wouldn't just survive the storm, I would become the person who could calm it. I used the recovered funds to establish the Amber Miles Second Chance Foundation. It was a bridge for children from toxic homes to access the education they deserved, a way to turn my own trauma into a legacy of light. Sterling met me at the cemetery that afternoon, his silhouette tall and grounded against the sunset. He didn't offer me a ring. He offered me a seat at the head of a new global board. "I don't need a wife, Amber," he said with profound respect. "I need a partner with the ethics to keep an empire honest." I looked at him and then at the quiet grave. "Forgiveness doesn't mean welcoming them back into my house, Sterling," I mused, the peace finally settling into my bones. "It means I no longer have to carry the weight of their shadows in my heart. I've reached the point where their names no longer trigger a heart rate spike. They are just stories I used to believe." We walked toward his car, the sunlight breaking through the trees like a promise kept. That moment changed everything. Not because I had money, but because I had myself. 1 year later, I stood in my own glass-walled office in downtown Houston, the city lights beginning to glitter like a sea of fallen stars. I was no longer the girl checking QR codes in the rain or the freeloader Lizzie used to mock. I was a titan of industry, respected for a quiet power that didn't need to shout to be heard. My name was on the door, and my integrity was the only currency that mattered. I had finally realized that being erased by them was the only way I could truly be written by myself. I occasionally received reports. Lizzie in her modest apartment learning to manage a budget, Gacy working a manual labor job in Austin, Jolene living a quiet, social media-free life. I monitored them with a distant, benevolent eye, ensuring they were safe but never allowing them back across the boundaries I had drawn in stone. True victory isn't when your enemies fall. It's when you no longer care that they were ever your enemies. I have finally come home to a place that no one else can take away. I picked up a single, unpolished amber gemstone on my desk, feeling its warmth against my palm. I looked out at the Houston skyline and smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that never once appeared during my years at the mansion. I had reclaimed the house, the money, and the name, but the greatest prize was the silence in my mind. She didn't win out of revenge. She won by choosing peace. Have you ever lived something like this? Tell me your story below. I read every one.